Margaret's fingers traced the worn wooden cross at her throat, a nervous habit she'd developed during her years of hiding behind the habit. The weight of Vincent's stare pressed against her back as she stood before the chapel's single window, watching the fog roll in from San Francisco Bay. In 3 hours, he would be dead. In 3 hours, whatever he knew about Sarah's murder would die with him. Sister Margaret. His voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. You've been avoiding my question. She turned slowly, forcing her expression into the serene mask she'd perfected over countless nights like this. Vincent Carrera sat motionless in his restraints, but his dark eyes held an intelligence that had always unsettled her. Over the past 6 months of spiritual counseling, she'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his demeanor. The way his left eye twitched when he lied, how his breathing changed when he was calculating his next move. Tonight, he was doing neither. Tonight, he was hunting. I haven't been avoiding anything, Vincent. I simply don't understand why you need to be alone with the statue. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Don't you? Margaret Alpha Delacroix? The name hit her like a physical blow. For 15 years she had been Sister Margaret, servant of God, minister to the dying. Margaret Alpha Delacroix was a ghost, a woman who had supposedly died in a prison transport accident outside Bakersfield, a woman who had been convicted of strangling her identical twin sister with a rosary. I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else. The lie came easily now, worn smooth by repetition. Vincent leaned forward as much as his chains would allow. The Virgin Mary statue, 17th century, carved from a single piece of oak, hollow base, sealed with wax and blessed by Father Miguel Santos in 1987. Shall I tell you what's hidden inside it, sister? Margaret's blood turned to ice water. The chapel suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in like a confessional that had become a trap. She had chosen this place specifically because of the statue. Its hidden compartment had seemed like divine providence when she discovered it 3 years ago, a perfect hiding spot for the evidence that could clear her name, DNA samples from under Sarah's fingernails that didn't match her own, photographs of bruising patterns that suggested a left-handed killer when Margaret was right-handed, witness statements that had been suppressed during her trial. You're scheduled for execution in less than 3 hours, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. Perhaps we should focus on preparing your soul for... My soul is already damned, sister. Has been since I took my first life at 14. Vincent's chains rattled as he shifted position. But yours might still be saved, if you give me those 5 minutes with Our Lady. The chapel door creaked open, and Officer Torres stepped inside, his hand resting casually on his radio. Everything all right in here, sister? Fine, thank you. She managed a reassuring nod. Mr. Carrera and I are just finishing our session. Torres's gaze lingered on Vincent before he retreated, leaving them alone again. Margaret waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor before speaking. What do you want from me? Justice. Vincent's voice dropped to a whisper. For both of us. You murdered 7 women. You strangled them with rosaries and left their bodies in churches. Where's the justice in that? I never denied what I did, but you've been denying what you didn't do for 15 years. He paused, studying her face. Sarah's still alive, isn't she? The words hit Margaret like a sledgehammer to the chest. The chapel spun around her, candlelight blurring into streaks of gold. Sarah, alive? Impossible. She had held her sister's cold body, had seen the life drain from eyes identical to her own. She had been convicted of the murder based on overwhelming evidence, her fingerprints on the rosary, no alibi for the time of death, a public argument with Sarah just hours before the killing. That's impossible, she breathed. Is it? You were always the smart one, Margaret. The forensic psychiatrist who could read minds, predict behavior, understand the criminal psyche. But you never could read your own sister, could you? Never knew how far she was willing to go to destroy you. Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the back of a wooden pew, splinters digging into her palms. Sarah is dead. I was there. I found her body. You found a body? Question is, whose body was it really? Vincent leaned back, his chains settling with a metallic sigh. Give me 5 minutes alone with the Virgin Mary, and I'll tell you everything. Refuse, and the truth dies with me at 12:01. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9:47 p.m. Outside, she could hear the protesters gathering, their chants for and against the execution growing louder as the hour approached. Margaret stared at the statue of the Virgin Mary, her painted eyes seeming to bore into Margaret's soul, demanding truth in this house of God. Margaret's hands trembled as she released her grip on the pew. The chapel felt like it was tilting, reality shifting beneath her feet like quicksand. Vincent's words echoed in her mind. Whose body was it really? But she forced herself to step back from the precipice of hope and despair he was dangling before her. I need time to think. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Time is exactly what we don't have, sister. Vincent's chains clinked softly as he gestured toward the clock. 9:48 now. In 2 hours and 13 minutes, they'll strap me to a gurney and pump poison into my veins. Whatever I know dies with me. Margaret turned away from him, her gaze falling on the small crucifix mounted beside the chapel's entrance. How many condemned men had she counseled in this room over the past 3 years? How many final confessions had she heard? She had built a life here among the dying, finding purpose in offering comfort to those society had deemed beyond redemption. It was a strange kind of penance, ministering to killers while hiding her own alleged crime. The irony wasn't lost on her. By day she worked in the chapel, offering spiritual guidance to murderers and thieves. By evening she returned to her small cell in the convent adjacent to the prison, where she lived among women who had devoted their lives to God. Sister Catherine, who made the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts Margaret had ever seen. Sister Rosa, who grew vegetables in the prison garden and hummed hymns while she worked. Sister Evelyn, who had taken Margaret under her wing when she first arrived, asking no questions about her past, accepting only her stated desire to serve. They had become her family, these women who rose at 4 a.m. for lauds and spent their days in service to the forgotten and forsaken. Margaret had found a peace here she'd never known in her previous life as Dr. Margaret Delacroix, forensic psychiatrist to the criminally insane. That woman had been driven by ambition, by the need to understand the darkness in human hearts. This woman, Sister Margaret, was driven by the need to heal. You built yourself quite a sanctuary here, didn't you? Vincent's voice cut through her reverie, hiding in plain sight. Very clever. Margaret's jaw tightened. I'm not hiding from anything. Then why haven't you retrieved what's in that statue? Why keep evidence of your innocence locked away for 3 years? Unless, his eyes narrowed, unless you're not entirely sure you're innocent. The accusation hit its mark. Margaret had spent 15 years questioning everything about that night. Sarah's final phone call, the argument that had erupted between them, the 2-hour gap in her memory after leaving Sarah's apartment. She remembered drinking wine, remembered Sarah's accusations about their inheritance, about Margaret's relationship with their father, but the hours between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. remained a black void, and it was at 10:30 p.m. that Sarah had supposedly died. Self-doubt is a luxury I can't afford, she said finally. But you do doubt. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at that statue. You're terrified that even if you prove your innocence, you'll discover something worse, that you were never the good sister, that Sarah was right about you all along. Margaret flinched. Sarah had always been the charismatic one, the beloved twin who could charm anyone. Margaret had been the studious one, the serious one, the one who dissected minds for a living. Their father had favored Sarah, their friends had gravitated towards Sarah, and even their mother, before her death, had seemed to prefer Sarah's easy laughter to Margaret's analytical nature. The chapel door opened again, and this time Warden Phillips entered, his expression grim. A tall man with silver hair and kind eyes, he had been the one to approve Margaret's request to serve as death row chaplain 3 years ago. He trusted her, relied on her to provide spiritual comfort in this place where hope came to die. Sister Margaret, I hate to interrupt, but we need to begin final preparations. Mr. Carrera needs to be moved to the holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. Margaret looked at Vincent, who met her gaze with unsettling calm. Of course, Warden. We were just finishing our prayer. Take your time. 5 more minutes. Phillips withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. 5 minutes. The same amount of time Vincent had requested with the Virgin Mary statue. It's almost poetic, isn't it? Vincent smiled. 5 minutes to decide whether you want to spend the rest of your life wondering what I knew. 5 minutes to choose between the safety of your doubt and the danger of the truth. Margaret stared at the statue of the Virgin Mary, her painted face serene and knowing. Hidden in its base were documents that could shatter the life she had carefully constructed here, or vindicate the woman she used to be. 3 years ago, she had placed them there as insurance, never imagining she might have reason to retrieve them. Now, a killer was offering her information that could change everything, and she had less than 5 minutes to decide whether the truth was worth the risk of losing the only peace she had ever known. The chapel's silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Margaret's eyes remained fixed on the Virgin Mary statue, its ancient wood seeming to pulse with secrets in the flickering candlelight. 3 years of careful peace hung in the balance. 3 years of morning prayers with Sister Catherine, of tending the prison garden, of finding purpose in offering last rites to the condemned. "You're asking me to destroy everything I've built here," she whispered. Vincent's chains rattled softly as he leaned forward. "I'm asking you to stop building your life on a foundation of lies." Before Margaret could respond, the chapel door burst open with unprecedented force. Warden Phillips stumbled inside, his face flushed and urgent, followed closely by a woman Margaret didn't recognize. Mid-40s, sharp-featured, wearing a rumpled FBI jacket over civilian clothes. "Sister Margaret, I'm sorry, but we have an emergency situation." Phillips's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "This is Special Agent Reese with the FBI. She needs to speak with Mr. Carrera immediately." Margaret's blood chilled. FBI agents didn't arrive at San Quentin 90 minutes before an execution unless something catastrophic had happened. She watched Vincent's face carefully, noting how his expression shifted from confident predator to wary calculation. Agent Reese stepped forward, her intense gaze sweeping between Vincent and Margaret. "Mr. Carrera, we've just received information linking you to 3 additional murders, cold cases from Nevada and Arizona, dating back 12 years. We need you to—" "No." Vincent's voice cut through the agent's words like a blade. "I'm done talking to law enforcement. If you want information from me, you'll have to wait for the afterlife." Reese's jaw tightened. "Mr. Carrera, we have families who deserve closure. If you have information about these murders—" "I said no." Vincent turned to Margaret, his dark eyes boring into hers with desperate intensity. "Sister, I believe our time is up. Perhaps you could escort these people out so I can have my requested 5 minutes with the Virgin Mary?" Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. The arrival of the FBI changed everything. If Vincent had information about additional murders, his execution might be delayed. The careful timing of his revelation about Sarah could be thrown into chaos. But more troubling was the way he was looking at her now, not like a man facing death, but like a man whose final gambit had just become infinitely more complicated. "Agent Reese," Margaret said carefully, "Mr. Carrera did request private time for prayer before his execution. As his spiritual advisor, I'm obligated to honor that request." Warden Phillips looked torn. "Sister, given these new developments—" "5 minutes," Vincent interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of desperation that sent alarm bells ringing in Margaret's head. "That's all I asked for. 5 minutes with the statue, and then I'll tell Agent Reese everything she wants to know." Reese stepped closer, her predatory instincts clearly triggered by Vincent's sudden cooperation. "Mr. Carrera, are you saying you'll provide information about the Nevada and Arizona murders?" Vincent's smile was enigmatic. "I'm saying that after I have my 5 minutes with Our Lady, I'll have a great deal to confess about many things." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Something had changed in Vincent's demeanor since the FBI's arrival. The confident man who had been toying with her about Sarah's supposed survival now seemed cornered, desperate. Was his claim about her sister just another manipulation, a final attempt to secure something he needed? Her gaze drifted to the Virgin Mary statue, and a terrible realization began to form. What if Vincent's interest in the statue wasn't about the evidence she had hidden there? What if he had his own secrets concealed in the chapel? She thought about the months he'd spent in spiritual counseling, always requesting the same chair, always positioned where he could see the statue clearly. "Warden," Agent Reese said firmly, "I strongly advise against—" The lights flickered suddenly, plunging the chapel into near darkness before the emergency generator kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. In that moment of disorientation, Margaret heard something that made her blood freeze. Vincent was no longer in his chair. The sound of chains hitting the floor echoed through the chapel like a death knell. Somehow, impossibly, Vincent Carrera had freed himself from restraints that should have been impossible to escape. Margaret spun toward the Virgin Mary statue and saw Vincent standing before it, his hands pressed against its base. The hidden compartment, her hidden compartment, was open, and papers scattered the floor like fallen leaves. But Vincent wasn't reaching for her evidence. He was placing something inside the statue's hollow interior, something that glinted metallic in the red emergency lighting. "Stop!" Agent Reese shouted, drawing her weapon. Vincent turned, his eyes finding Margaret's across the chaos of the chapel. "Choose, sister. The truth about Sarah, or the safety of your silence. But choose now, because after tonight nothing will ever be the same." The ordinary world she had built crumbled around her as Margaret realized she was no longer just hiding from her past. She was standing at the center of something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Time seemed suspended in the red emergency lighting. The chapel transformed into something hellish and surreal. Margaret stood frozen, her mind racing through impossible calculations. Agent Reese's weapon was trained on Vincent, who remained motionless before the violated statue, his freed hands still pressed against the hollow base, where her carefully guarded secrets lay exposed. "Step away from the statue, Mr. Carrera. Now." Reese's voice cut through the emergency lighting's mechanical hum, but Margaret couldn't move, couldn't breathe. 15 years of carefully constructed lies were scattered across the chapel floor like autumn leaves, and Vincent had added something to the hiding place, something metallic that caught the red light like a fallen star. The evidence of her innocence lay mingled with whatever Vincent had concealed, creating a constellation of secrets that could destroy them both. "I can't," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "I can't choose." The weight of her cowardice settled over her like a burial shroud. For 3 years, she had told herself she was serving God by ministering to the condemned, but the truth was uglier. She had been serving her own fear. Fear that the evidence wouldn't be enough. Fear that even if she proved her innocence in Sarah's death, the world would discover the darker truths about who she really was. Because Sarah hadn't been entirely wrong during their final argument. Margaret had been jealous. Bitterly, poisonously jealous of her twin sister's effortless charm, her ability to make their father laugh, her talent for making everything look easy. Even their mother's deathbed blessing had gone to Sarah. "Take care of your sister, sweetheart. She'll need you to show her how to be happy." As if Margaret were some broken thing that required Sarah's golden touch to be made whole. "You're afraid," Vincent said softly, his voice carrying clearly across the chapel despite Agent Reese's shouted commands. "Not of being guilty, of being exactly what Sarah always said you were, the cold one, the analytical one, the sister who could dissect a human mind but never learned how to love." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Margaret's breath hitched as she remembered Sarah's voice during that last phone call, slurred with wine and venom. "You know what your problem is, Margaret. You think because you understand crazy people, you understand people, but you don't understand the first thing about being human." "That's enough," Warden Phillips barked, finally finding his voice. "Officer Torres, call for backup." No backup will arrive in time, Vincent said calmly. The emergency lighting system triggers a facility lockdown. Standard protocol. We have approximately 8 minutes before anyone can reach us. 8 minutes. Margaret's gaze darted between Vincent and the scattered papers at the statue's base. Among them, she could see fragments of the documents that had haunted her for 3 years, DNA evidence, witness statements, crime scene photographs that had never made it to her trial. But now they were contaminated by whatever Vincent had hidden, tainted by his presence and his impossible claims about Sarah. "What did you put in there?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Vincent's smile was sad, almost gentle. "Proof, sister. Proof that some sins can be forgiven and some truths are too terrible to bear alone." Agent Reese took a step forward, her weapon still trained on Vincent's center mass. "Mr. Carrera, you have 3 seconds to step away from that statue before you what? Shoot an unarmed man?" Vincent spread his hands wide, the gesture strangely graceful in the red lighting. "I'm scheduled to die in less than 2 hours anyway. You'd simply be saving the state some paperwork." Margaret watched this exchange with growing horror. She realized the true scope of her paralysis. She wasn't just afraid of the truth about Sarah's death. She was afraid of any truth that would force her to leave this sanctuary she had built among the condemned. Sister Catherine would ask questions. Sister Rosa would want explanations. Sister Evelyn, who had become the mother Margaret never really had, would look at her with disappointment and betrayal. Here, in this chapel that served the forgotten and the damned, Margaret had found the only family that had ever accepted her completely. They knew her as a woman of God, a minister to the dying, someone whose past was irrelevant compared to her present service. If she reached for those papers, if she grasped for vindication and truth, she would lose the only identity that had ever brought her peace. "Choose, Margaret," Vincent said again, his voice gentle now, almost compassionate. "But understand what you're choosing between. Not innocence or guilt. Those are just legal constructs. You're choosing between the woman you've pretended to be and the woman you actually are. And sister," his eyes found hers across the red-lit space, "only one of those women deserves to know what really happened to Sarah." The chapel fell silent except for the hum of emergency power and the distant sound of protesters gathering outside for the midnight execution. Margaret stood at the crossroads of her life, surrounded by scattered evidence and armed federal agents, and a killer who somehow held the key to 15 years of questions. And still, she could not move. The sound of her own heartbeat thundered in Margaret's ears as she stared at the scattered papers, each document a fragment of the life she'd abandoned. In the crimson emergency lighting, the evidence looked like spilled blood across the chapel floor. DNA reports, witness statements, crime scene photographs that had never seen a courtroom. 15 years of questions lay before her, demanding answers she'd been too terrified to seek. "I can't," she whispered again. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were a lie. She could choose. She had always been able to choose. The truth was that she'd been choosing her comfortable prison over uncertain freedom every single day for 3 years. Vincent remained motionless before the violated statue, his dark eyes reflecting the red emergency lights like twin flames.
"Time is running out, sister. In 7 minutes, backup arrives. In 93 minutes, I die. And your sister—"
He paused, letting the weight of possibility hang in the air. "Your sister remains trapped in whatever hell you've created for her by accepting her death." Agent Reese's weapon never wavered. "Sister Margaret, I need you to step back from this situation. Whatever Mr. Carrera has told you, he told me Sarah is alive." The words escaped before Margaret could stop them, raw and desperate in the red-lit chapel. The admission shattered something inside her chest, a wall she'd built from prayer and routine and the careful tending of other people's last moments. For 3 years she had poured herself into the condemned because their deaths were certain, their stories finished. There was safety in ministering to the dying. No questions, no complications, no terrible possibilities that demanded action. But Sarah, if Vincent was telling the truth, Sarah was unfinished business. Sarah was choice and consequence and all the messy complications of the living. Warden Phillips stepped forward, his face etched with concern. "Sister, you're clearly under duress. Mr. Carrera is a manipulative individual with extensive training in psychological warfare." "No." Margaret's voice grew stronger, steadier. She could feel something shifting inside her, a tectonic movement of will that had been building for 3 years. "He's telling me something I need to hear." She took a step toward the scattered papers, then another. Agent Reese swiveled her weapon slightly, covering both Margaret and Vincent now. "Sister Margaret, do not approach that evidence. This is an active federal crime scene." But Margaret was already kneeling among the documents, her hands trembling as she touched papers she hadn't seen since the night she'd hidden them. Her breath caught as she recognized her own handwriting on a witness statement, her account of the hours before Sarah's supposed death, written in her careful psychiatric notes. Subject exhibited signs of acute intoxication and emotional distress, made repeated accusations regarding family finances and father's favoritism. Left apartment at approximately 9 p.m. after heated exchange. No further contact. Beneath it lay a DNA report that had never made it to her trial, showing unidentified genetic material under Sarah's fingernails that didn't match Margaret's profile. Crime scene photographs revealed details that had been suppressed, signs of struggle that suggested an intruder, not a family altercation gone wrong. "My lawyer buried this," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "He buried it all." Vincent's voice was soft, almost gentle. "Your father made certain arrangements. He believed you were guilty, but he couldn't bear to lose both daughters. So he ensured you'd be convicted of a lesser charge, with possibility of escape during transport. He paid for your freedom, Margaret, but at the cost of your innocence." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her father, the man who had always favored Sarah, who had looked at Margaret with disappointment and barely concealed frustration, had orchestrated her escape while simultaneously ensuring she'd never know the truth of her innocence. "He wanted me to run," she whispered. "He wanted you to disappear, to live with the guilt he believed you deserved, but to live nonetheless. He never imagined you'd try to prove your innocence." Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the metallic object Vincent had placed among her papers. It was a key, old brass, tarnished with age. Attached was a safety deposit box number and a bank name in Sacramento. "What is this?" Vincent's smile was sad, knowing. "The rest of the truth, sister. Your father's insurance policy. Everything he discovered after your escape, including where Sarah has been for the past 15 years. The chapel seemed to spin around her. Margaret gripped the key so tightly its edges cut into her palm, drawing blood that looked black in the emergency lighting. This small piece of metal represented everything she'd been hiding from. Answers, consequences, the terrifying possibility that her carefully constructed life of penance had been built on a foundation of lies. Agent Reese's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Sister Margaret, step away from that evidence immediately." But Margaret was already rising, the key clutched in her bloodied fist. She looked at Vincent one last time, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as a killer seeking absolution, but as a messenger bearing truths too heavy for one person to carry alone. "There's no going back, is there?" "No," Vincent said softly. "There never was." Margaret took a deep breath and crossed the threshold of her old life into whatever lay beyond. Tests and allies. Margaret's first step toward the chapel door sent shockwaves through the room. Agent Reese moved to intercept her, weapon still drawn but lowered slightly in confusion. "Sister Margaret, you cannot leave with that evidence. This is a federal investigation." "This is my life," Margaret said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. The key felt warm in her bleeding palm, its weight somehow both insignificant and earth-shattering. 15 years of my life based on lies." Warden Phillips stepped between them, his weathered face creased with concern. "Sister, think about what you're doing. You have a good life here. The inmates respect you. The sisters depend on you. Don't throw it all away for the truth?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Warden, you've spent your career dealing with people who've made terrible choices. You know better than anyone that running from truth only delays the reckoning." She turned back to Vincent, who watched the scene unfold with an expression of calm satisfaction. "Why now? You could have died with your secrets. Why involve me in whatever game this is?" Vincent's chains clinked as he shifted position. "Because some burdens are too heavy to carry alone into eternity, sister, and because—" His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried across the chapel. "Sarah asked me to find you." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Agent Reese stepped closer, her predatory instincts clearly triggered. "Mr. Carrera, are you admitting contact with Sarah Delacroix, a supposed murder victim?" "I'm admitting many things, Agent Reese, but not to you, not yet." Vincent's gaze never left Margaret's face. "Sister, you have 47 minutes to reach Sacramento before the banks close for the weekend. The contents of that safety deposit box won't wait." Margaret's mind raced through the implications. Sacramento was 90 minutes away in good traffic. If she left now, drove like her life depended on it, because perhaps it did, she might reach the bank before closing. But leaving meant abandoning Vincent to face his execution alone. It meant breaking every protocol that governed her life as a nun. It meant stepping fully into an unknown world where the rules she'd lived by for 3 years no longer applied. "The FBI will stop me," she said, testing the boundaries of this new reality. Agent Reese nodded grimly. "Sister Margaret, you are now a material witness in a federal investigation. I cannot allow you to leave with potential evidence." "Actually," Warden Phillips interrupted, his voice thoughtful, "she can." Every head turned toward him. Phillips straightened his shoulders, assuming the authoritative posture that had governed San Quentin for 2 decades. "Sister Margaret is not an employee of the state. She's a volunteer minister operating under religious protection statutes. Unless Agent Reese is prepared to formally arrest a Catholic nun for obstruction of justice without evidence of actual obstruction, she has the right to leave." Margaret stared at Phillips in shock. The warden had always been kind to her, but this felt like more than professional courtesy. This felt like alliance. Agent Reese's jaw tightened. "Warden, you're making a serious mistake. This woman could be harboring a fugitive." "This woman," Phillips said firmly, "has spent 3 years bringing comfort to dying men when no one else would. If Sister Margaret says she needs to pursue the truth about her past, then I trust her judgment." He turned to Margaret, his eyes steady. "But sister, if you do this, there's no coming back unchanged. You understand that?" Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood anything anymore. The chapel that had been her sanctuary now felt like a launching pad into chaos. Everything familiar. The routines of prayer, the comfort of serving the condemned, the safety of her assumed identity was dissolving around her. "I'll need civilian clothes," she said, surprised by the practicality of her own voice. "Sister Catherine keeps spare outfits in the administration office," Phillips replied, "for family members who need to clean up after difficult visits." Vincent spoke again, his voice urgent now. "Sister, when you open that box, you'll understand why I had to free myself from those restraints tonight, why I had to plant additional evidence in your hiding place. The truth about Sarah is connected to cases Agent Reese has been investigating. My death tonight would have buried information that could save lives." Agent Reese spun toward him. "What cases? The Nevada murders? Arizona? Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas, Reno?" Vincent rattled off the cities like a prayer. 7 women over 3 years. All reported missing, never found. All connected to the same network that's been hiding Sarah. Margaret felt the chapel floor shift beneath her feet. This wasn't just about her sister anymore. This wasn't just about her own innocence or guilt. People were dying while she had hidden in her safe sanctuary of prayer and routine. 44 minutes, sister," Vincent said softly. "The choice is no longer just yours to make. Margaret looked at the key in her bloody palm one final time, then closed her fist around it decisively. "Warden, I'll need those clothes now." Phillips led Margaret through corridors she had walked countless times, but everything looked different now. Sharper, more urgent, painted in the harsh fluorescent lighting that had replaced the chapel's emergency glow. Her habit rustled against the walls as they moved quickly toward the administration wing, the familiar sound now feeling like a countdown timer to the end of her religious life. "Sister Catherine's office is just ahead," Phillips said, his voice low. Behind them, Margaret could hear Agent Reese barking orders into her radio, coordinating what sounded like a manhunt. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 3 years of hiding in plain sight, she was about to become a fugitive again by choice. "Warden," Margaret said as they reached the office door, "why are you helping me?" Phillips paused, his hand on the doorknob. In the harsh hallway lighting, she could see the weight of his years managing death row, the lines around his eyes, the grey stubble that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Because I've watched you bring peace to 47 men before their execution, sister. I've seen you hold their hands when family wouldn't come, heard you pray with them when chaplains couldn't stomach their crimes. If you say you need to find the truth, then maybe that's what those men would want for you too." He opened the door to reveal a small office cluttered with administrative files and a metal locker against the far wall. Phillips quickly retrieved a set of civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain sweater, sneakers that looked roughly Margaret's size. "These should work," he said, then turned toward the door. "I'll give you privacy to change. But sister," he paused in the doorway, "once you put those clothes on, you can't be Sister Margaret Alpha anymore. Not here, not tonight. You understand that?" Margaret nodded, though the gesture felt inadequate for what he was really asking. When she removed her habit, she would be shedding more than fabric. She would be abandoning the identity that had saved her from despair, the community that had accepted her without question, the calling that had given her life meaning. Phillips closed the door behind him, leaving her alone with civilian clothes and the weight of an impossible choice. Margaret's hands trembled as she began unfastening her habit. Each piece of religious garment felt heavier as she removed it. The veil that had hidden her face from surveillance cameras, the tunic that had marked her as someone beyond suspicion, the rosary that had become as essential as breathing. She folded each item carefully, as if preparing for a journey from which she might never return. The civilian clothes felt foreign against her skin, too tight, too exposed, too worldly. In the small mirror above Sister Catherine's desk, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the serene nun who had counseled the condemned. In her place stood a woman who looked dangerous, desperate, capable of the violence she had spent 3 years atoning for. The key felt heavier in her pocket, its brass edges a constant reminder of the clock ticking toward Sacramento. 38 minutes now, if Vincent's timeline was accurate. 38 minutes to drive 90 miles and unlock 15 years of buried truth. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Sister?" Phillips's voice came through the door. "We have a problem?" Margaret opened the door to find not just Phillips, but Agent Reese waiting in the hallway. The federal agent's expression was grim, determined. "Miss Delacroix," Reese said, using Margaret's real name like a weapon. "I've been in contact with my field office. The Nevada murders Vincent mentioned? 3 of those women had connections to psychiatric facilities. One of them was a former patient of someone matching your description." The hallway seemed to tilt around Margaret. "That's impossible. I've been here for 3 years. Someone using credentials similar to yours. Someone with your psychiatric training and knowledge of criminal psychology." Reese stepped closer. "Which means either you've been lying about your activities or someone has been using your identity to gain access to victims." Margaret's mind raced through the implications. If someone was impersonating her, using her background to hurt people, then Vincent's claim about Sarah being connected to these cases took on terrifying new dimensions. The safety deposit box in Sacramento wasn't just about her past anymore. It might be the key to stopping ongoing murders. 35 minutes, Phillips said quietly, checking his watch. Agent Reese's radio crackled with an update that made her face go pale. She stepped away to take the call. her voice dropping to urgent whispers that Margaret couldn't quite catch. When Reese returned, her entire demeanor had shifted. The skeptical federal agent was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely afraid. "There's been another murder," she said. "Las Vegas, 2 hours ago. A psychiatric social worker named Diana Chen, found with a rosary wrapped around her throat." She looked directly at Margaret. "The killer left a note addressed to Sister Margaret Alpha Delacroix." The hallway fell silent except for the distant sound of approaching sirens, backup finally arriving, too late to matter. "What did the note say?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Reese's voice was barely audible. It said, "Your sister wants to come home." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but what followed was worse. The silence, the terrible, expanding silence, as the three of them absorbed the implications of a killer who knew exactly where Margaret was, who she had become, and how to tear apart the sanctuary she'd built from the wreckage of her life. Agent Reese's radio crackled again, urgent voices layering over each other in a symphony of crisis management. Margaret heard fragments: roadblocks on I-80, bank surveillance, possible hostage situation, but the words seemed to come from another world. Her world had contracted to the brass key cutting into her palm and the growing certainty that running from the truth had never been an option. "The killer knows you're here," Reese said, her training taking over despite the fear in her eyes. "This whole scenario, Vincent's final confession, the timing of tonight's murder, even the note, it's orchestrated. Someone wanted you to find that evidence. Someone wanted you running towards Sacramento." Philip stepped protectively closer to Margaret. "Then we keep her here, lock down the facility." "No." Margaret's voice cut through their planning with unexpected force. She looked at Agent Reese directly, no longer the compliant nun seeking permission. "You said Diana Chen was a psychiatric social worker. What was her specialty?" Reese hesitated, clearly uncomfortable sharing details of an active investigation. Trauma victims, specifically women recovering from identity theft and psychological abuse. The pieces clicked together in Margaret's mind with the terrible precision of a diagnosis. Someone hadn't just been using her credentials to access victims, they had been hunting women who, like Margaret herself, were trying to rebuild their lives from devastating betrayals of trust. "He's been using me as bait," she breathed. "All this time, I thought I was hiding, but I was advertising my location to someone who's been waiting 15 years to finish what started the night Sarah died." The approaching sirens grew louder, and Margaret could see emergency lights beginning to strobe through the windows at the end of the hallway. Vincent's execution was 32 minutes away, but that timeline belonged to a different crisis now. The real countdown was to whenever the killer decided Margaret had served her purpose as a lure. Agent Reese's phone buzzed with a text that made her face go completely white. She showed the screen to Margaret, a photo of the Virgin Mary statue taken just minutes ago in the chapel, with a new message carved into its base: "Family reunion at midnight." "He's here," Reese whispered. "In the facility, right now." The emergency lights outside painted the hallway in alternating red and blue, creating a strobe effect that made Margaret feel like she was moving through a nightmare. But the fear was different now, not the paralyzing terror of the unknown, but the sharp, focused dread of confronting something that had been stalking her for years. "The safety deposit box," she said suddenly. "It's not about evidence. It's about drawing me out into the open, away from witnesses, away from protection." She looked at Phillips. "How many ways are there out of this facility?" "Margaret, you can't seriously be thinking," Reese started. "I'm thinking that Diana Chen died because someone is using me to hunt women like her. I'm thinking that Vincent knew this would happen tonight and chose to die rather than be part of it anymore. I'm thinking that my sister, if she's alive, is either prisoner or partner in whatever this is." Margaret's voice grew steadier with each word, the analytical mind that had once diagnosed the deepest human traumas, finally turning its full attention to her own crisis. Phillips was already moving toward the security station at the end of the hallway. "Loading dock, main gate, staff entrance, and the tunnel system that connects to the courthouse," he said over his shoulder. "But if someone's already inside—" An alarm began blaring, not the execution warning, but the facility's security breach alert. Red lights flashed in every corridor as the automated voice announced, "Lockdown initiated. All personnel remain in current locations." "Too late," Reese muttered, drawing her weapon again. But Margaret was already moving in the opposite direction, back toward the chapel. Everything in her training told her that facing a predator required understanding their psychology, their motivations, their endgame. And if Vincent had been telling the truth, if he had spent his final hours trying to warn her rather than manipulate her, then the answers she needed were still in that room with him. "Margaret, stop!" Reese called after her. "You're walking into exactly what they want." Margaret paused at the corner, looking back at the agent who had gone from interrogator to protector in the span of a single phone call. "Agent Reese, what they want is for me to keep running. What they want is 15 more years of me hiding while women die." She held up the key one final time before slipping it back into her pocket. "I'm done running." The chapel door was 50 yards away, and whatever truth waited behind it, about Sarah, about the murders, about the life she'd built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies, could no longer be postponed. Margaret Alpha Delacroix walked toward her reckoning. The chapel door stood ajar when Margaret reached it, which was wrong. She had locked it herself when they left Vincent alone with the Virgin Mary statue. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, turning the sacred space into something from a fever dream. The silence was absolute, swallowing even the distant alarms that continued to blare throughout the facility. Vincent's body was gone. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The execution restraints lay empty on the floor like shed skin, their leather straps cut clean through. The Virgin Mary statue remained in its alcove, but something was different, wrong in a way that made her stomach clench with recognition. Blood. Fresh blood pooled at the statue's base, spelling out words in careful, deliberate strokes. "Welcome home, Alpha." The handwriting was her own. "Impossible," she whispered. But even as the word left her lips, she was moving forward, drawn by a compulsion stronger than fear. Her civilian clothes felt like a costume now, a disguise that fooled no one, least of all herself. The key in her pocket seemed to pulse with heat, reminding her of the 30 minutes still remaining before midnight, before Vincent's scheduled execution that would now never come. She reached the statue and knelt beside the blood message, her hands trembling as she touched the warm liquid. Real blood, fresh, but not Vincent's. She knew that with the certainty of someone who had spent years studying crime scenes. This blood belonged to someone else, someone who had been brought here specifically for this moment. The hidden compartment behind the Virgin Mary was open, empty. 3 years of carefully preserved evidence, photographs, DNA samples, financial records that proved her innocence in Sarah's death, all gone. The one thing that could have cleared her name and restored her life had been stolen by someone who knew exactly where to look. "You hid it well, but not well enough." The voice came from behind her, familiar yet wrong, like an echo distorted by distance and time. Margaret turned slowly, already knowing what she would see but praying she was mistaken. Sarah stood in the chapel doorway, alive and perfect, and wearing the face Margaret saw in mirrors. But it wasn't Sarah, not the sister she remembered. This woman carried herself differently, moved with predatory grace that belonged in profile databases and FBI behavioral analyses. This was what 15 years of carefully cultivated psychopathy looked like when it wore a beloved face. "Hello, Alpha," Sarah said, using the childhood nickname that now sounded like a curse. "I've missed our sessions together." Margaret's psychiatric training kicked in, analyzing even as her heart shattered. The clinical detachment that had served her well with condemned prisoners now became her lifeline. "You're the one who's been killing them. The women in Nevada, Arizona. You've been using my credentials, my background." Sarah smiled, and it was like looking into a funhouse mirror that reflected only the capacity for violence Margaret had spent her life fighting against. I've been continuing your work, sister. You always were so good at understanding broken minds. I simply learned to break them more efficiently. The realization hit Margaret with devastating clarity. The night 15 years ago when Sarah supposedly died, it hadn't been murder at all. It had been Sarah's transformation into something else entirely, using Margaret's own psychological research as a blueprint for becoming the perfect predator. Vincent knew, Margaret said, backing toward the altar as Sarah moved deeper into the chapel. That's why he confessed tonight. That's why he wanted to die, to stop being part of your network. Poor Vincent. He developed a conscience at the most inconvenient time. Sarah pulled a scalpel from her jacket, the blade catching the emergency lighting. But his death will be blamed on you anyway. The escaped murderer who came back to finish what she started. They'll find his body in your quarters, along with evidence of all the women I've killed in your name. Margaret felt the cold marble of the altar against her back and realized she had nowhere left to run. The chapel that had been her sanctuary for 3 years was about to become her tomb, and Sarah, the sister she had grieved for, prayed for, built a life of penance around, was going to ensure that Margaret died with the guilt of murders she never committed. The key, Sarah continued, holding out her free hand. The safety deposit box in Sacramento contains more than evidence, Alpha. It contains a list of my future victims, women like Diana Chen, who help people disappear, who might help you disappear again. I can't have that. Margaret's hand closed around the brass key, her final bargaining chip in a game she was already losing. Outside, she could hear Agent Reese shouting orders, coordinating a search that would find only Margaret's carefully staged guilt. Everything she had built, her identity as Sister Margaret, her work with the condemned, her fragile peace with a God who might or might not exist, was crumbling around her. In 30 minutes she would either be dead or blamed for Vincent's murder. Either way, the woman who had found redemption in San Quentin's chapel was about to cease to exist. Margaret Alpha Delacroix had walked into her reckoning, and she was losing. The key cut deeper into Margaret's palm as she gripped it, and in that moment of physical pain, a memory surfaced with startling clarity. Sarah, at age 12, crying over a dead bird they'd found in their backyard. Not crying with grief, but with frustration that she couldn't make it move anymore, couldn't control it. Margaret had dismissed it as childhood curiosity, the way she'd dismissed so many other signs over the years. But now, staring at the sister she'd mourned for 15 years, Margaret finally understood what she'd been looking at her entire life. "You didn't become this," she said, her voice steady despite the scalpel pointed at her heart. "You always were this. I just refused to see it." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "Always so analytical, Alpha, even when you're about to die. The night you disappeared, you weren't my victim. I was yours." The revelation unfolded in Margaret's mind with devastating precision. "You staged your own death to frame me, but something went wrong. I was supposed to be convicted, wasn't I? Supposed to be executed for your murder while you started fresh with a new identity. 25 to life instead of death row," Sarah acknowledged, moving closer. "A disappointing outcome, but workable. I had to adjust my timeline, but watching you suffer in prison for 15 years had its own appeal." Margaret's mind raced through the psychological profile taking shape before her. "But I escaped during transport, ruined your perfect narrative. You spent 3 years trying to track me down, using my credentials to access the kind of women who help people disappear, trying to find me through them." "Diana Chen was particularly helpful before she died," Sarah said casually. "She mentioned a nun at San Quentin who'd appeared 3 years ago with an unusual background in forensic psychiatry. Amazing what people will tell you when they think you're seeking therapy for trauma." The emergency lights continued strobing, painting the chapel in hellish reds that made Sarah's face look demonic. But Margaret was beginning to see something else in her sister's expression, something that changed everything. Fear. Not the controlled wariness of a predator, but genuine fear. Sarah was talking too much, staying too far away, holding the scalpel like someone who had never used it up close. The meticulous planning, the elaborate psychological manipulation, the years of careful staging. It was all the work of someone who avoided direct confrontation. "You've never actually killed anyone yourself, have you?" Margaret said, the pieces clicking together. "Vincent, the others, they were your instruments. You manipulate them into doing the killing while you stay safe behind the scenes." Sarah's grip on the scalpel tightened. Vincent was weak, started having conversations with that ridiculous statue, claiming the Virgin Mary was speaking to him, claiming she told him about redemption, about the possibility of stopping cycles of violence. Her voice turned bitter. Religious delusion made him useless. "And now you're here, holding a blade you've never used, facing the one person who knew you before you learned to hide what you are." Margaret took a step forward, and Sarah instinctively stepped back. "You're terrified, Sarah, because for the first time in 15 years, you can't manipulate someone else into doing your killing for you." The realization was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Margaret had spent 3 years counseling murderers, learning to recognize the difference between those who killed from impulse and those who killed from calculation. Sarah was a chess master who had never held a gun, a conductor who had never played an instrument. "Where's Vincent's body?" Margaret pressed, taking another step forward. "Safe," Sarah said, but the word came out too quickly. "Hidden where?" "He's alive." The truth hit Margaret like lightning. You couldn't kill him yourself, and without his cooperation, you had no way to murder him. So you moved him, probably drugged him, and you're hoping I'll do the killing for you. That's what this has all been about, turning me into the monster you've always needed me to be. Sarah raised the scalpel higher, but her hand was shaking now. "You killed me 15 years ago, Alpha, in that basement with your hands around my throat. I never touched you." Margaret's voice rang with absolute certainty. "Whatever theater you performed that night, whatever evidence you planted, whatever story you told yourself to justify everything that came after, I never laid a hand on you, and we both know it." The chapel fell silent except for their breathing and the distant sound of Agent Reese coordinating the search. 22 minutes until midnight. 22 minutes until Vincent's scheduled execution that would now become the centerpiece of Sarah's final manipulation. But Margaret was no longer the terrified runaway who had built a life from guilt and penance. Standing in the chapel where she had found purpose counseling the condemned, she finally understood the difference between justice and revenge, between accountability and self-destruction. Sarah needed Margaret to become a killer. Everything depended on it. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in 15 years she felt truly free. "The difference between us," Margaret said, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd developed counseling death row inmates, "is that I've spent 3 years learning what real monsters look like. And you're not one of them, Sarah. You're just broken." Sarah's scalpel wavered as Margaret continued advancing. "Stay back. You'll what? Cut me? You've never killed anyone directly in your life. You're a puppet master, not a predator." Margaret kept her tone clinical, therapeutic even, drawing on every technique she'd learned for de-escalating violent prisoners. "Vincent figured that out, didn't he? That's why he confessed tonight, not to protect you, but to break free from your control." The emergency lights strobed across Sarah's face, and Margaret saw something she'd never expected to find there: desperation. After 15 years of orchestrating elaborate psychological manipulations, Sarah was trapped in a scenario she couldn't control through others. "Where is he?" Margaret asked, stopping just beyond the scalpel's reach. "Where did you hide Vincent?" "It doesn't matter." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "By midnight, you'll be dead or arrested for his murder, and I'll disappear again. New name, new life, new network of new victims. You can't kill yourself." Margaret felt pieces clicking into place with the precision of a psychiatric evaluation. "Diana Chen, the others, you didn't murder them. You found broken men like Vincent and programmed them to do it while you watched from a safe distance. The chapel door burst open behind them, and Agent Reese entered with her weapon drawn, backup flooding in behind her. But instead of feeling relief, Margaret held up her hand in a stopping gesture. "Wait," she said firmly. "Don't interrupt this." Reese hesitated, clearly torn between procedure and the strange authority in Margaret's voice.
"Margaret, step away from her."
In a moment. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on Sarah's face, watching for the telltale signs of psychological collapse she'd learned to recognize. "First, I need my sister to understand something." "Sarah, look at me. Really look at me. What do you see?" Sarah's breathing was shallow, panicked. "I see the woman who destroyed my life. You see the woman you chose as your scapegoat because I was the only one close enough to understand what you really are." Margaret's voice remained steady, professional. "But I'm not that frightened graduate student anymore. I've spent 3 years learning about redemption from people who've committed actual murders. I know the difference between genuine remorse and manipulative performance." She reached slowly into her pocket and withdrew the brass key, holding it up where everyone could see it. "This key doesn't open evidence that proves my innocence, does it? It opens something else entirely." Sarah lunged forward with the scalpel, but it was the desperate movement of someone who had never learned to fight. Margaret sidestepped easily, her reflexes honed by 3 years of managing unpredictable prisoners, and Sarah stumbled past her into the altar. Agent Reese was moving before Sarah hit the marble, her backup surrounding the fallen woman within seconds. The scalpel clattered across the chapel floor, and Sarah made no attempt to retrieve it. Instead, she began laughing, high, brittle sound that echoed off the sacred walls. "You think you've won?" Sarah gasped between laughs. "Vincent's dying right now, bleeding out in a place you'll never find. And when they discover his body tomorrow, all the evidence will point to you." Margaret knelt beside her sister as Agent Reese secured the scalpel. "Because Vincent isn't your victim anymore, Sarah. He's your witness." From her jacket pocket, Margaret pulled out a small digital recorder she'd taken from the chaplain's office, the same device she used to record sessions with condemned prisoners who wanted their final statements preserved. "Vincent spent 2 hours tonight telling me exactly how you recruited him, how you manipulated him into killing those women, how you've been building a network of vulnerable men to serve as your instruments." Margaret's smile was gentle, therapeutic, the expression of someone who had learned to find compassion even for the irredeemable. "You're lying," Sarah whispered, but the fight had gone out of her voice. "I'm not the one who lies in this family." Margaret stood as Agent Reese hauled Sarah to her feet. "Vincent is alive, Sarah, safely in protective custody as of 20 minutes ago, ready to testify about everything you've done. The key opens a storage unit containing his detailed journals about your operation, insurance he kept against the day you decided he'd outlived his usefulness." The emergency lights continued their hellish strobe, but Margaret no longer felt trapped by their rhythm. For the first time in 15 years, she was exactly where she belonged, not running from the truth, but facing it with the strength she'd found in helping others confront their own darkness. Sarah was led away in handcuffs, and Margaret finally understood that some kinds of freedom could only be won by standing still. The chapel fell eerily quiet after Sarah's footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving only the diminishing echo of her chains and the steady rhythm of the emergency lights. Margaret remained standing by the altar, the brass key still warm in her palm, watching Agent Reese coordinate with her team through the doorway. The immediate crisis was over, but Margaret felt the weight of unfinished business pressing against her chest like a physical force. "We'll need a full statement," Agent Reese said, approaching with careful steps. Her weapon was holstered now, but her eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easy resolutions. "About your sister, about Vincent, about everything that led to tonight." Margaret nodded, but her attention was drawn to the Virgin Mary statue. The hidden compartment behind it gaped open like a wound, empty of the evidence she had guarded for 3 years. The blood message at the statue's base had begun to darken, and she could see now that it wasn't random. The smears formed letters, barely legible but deliberate. Alpha written in what she now knew was Vincent's blood, drawn by Sarah as part of her elaborate staging. "There's more," Margaret said, turning back to Agent Reese. "Sarah didn't work alone, not completely. She built a network, identified vulnerable men in psychiatric facilities, prisons, halfway houses. Vincent was just one of them. The implications hung between them like smoke. How many other manipulated killers were out there? How many murders attributed to random violence or serial killers acting alone were actually part of Sarah's orchestrated campaign?" Margaret pulled out Vincent's confession tape again, her fingers tracing its edges. He gave me names, locations, details about other men she recruited over the years. She paused, feeling the full weight of her next words. "I'm the only one who can identify them, Agent Reese. My psychological background, my understanding of how Sarah operates, I'm the key to unraveling everything she's built." "You're also a fugitive who's been living under false identity for 3 years, Agent Reese pointed out, though not unkindly. "Margaret Alpha Delacroix officially escaped federal custody. Sister Margaret doesn't legally exist." The truth of it settled over Margaret like a shroud. Even with Sarah's confession and Vincent's testimony, she would face consequences for her years in hiding. Prison time, certainly. Loss of her medical license, her life at San Quentin, the fragile sense of purpose she'd built among the condemned. But looking around the chapel, at the simple wooden cross, the flickering votive candles, the chairs where she'd sat with dozens of prisoners helping them find peace before their final hours, Margaret realized she was no longer afraid of those consequences. "I've been running for 15 years, she said, more to herself than to Agent Reese. "First from a crime I didn't commit, then from the truth about who my sister really was, then from the possibility that maybe I could have stopped her if I'd been brave enough to see clearly." She walked to the nearest pew and sat down, feeling the familiar comfort of the worn wood beneath her hands. This chapel had been her sanctuary, her confessional, her classroom in the art of facing impossible truths. Tomorrow it would return to serving other prisoners, offering the same potential for redemption she'd found here. "Whatever happens to me legally," Margaret continued, "I need to finish this. Those other victims, the men Sarah manipulated, they deserve the same chance at truth that Vincent found tonight. Some of them might even be innocent, coerced into confessing to crimes they didn't commit because they thought it would please her." Agent Reese studied her carefully. "You're talking about potentially overturning dozens of convictions, reopening cases across multiple states. The legal ramifications alone will take years to resolve," Margaret finished. "I know, but that's what justice actually looks like, isn't it? Not the clean resolution we want, but the messy, complicated work of unraveling lies that have had decades to take root." Through the chapel doorway she could see the first hints of dawn touching the prison yard. Vincent's execution had been officially suspended an hour ago, and by now he would be in a federal facility, beginning the long process of helping authorities understand the scope of Sarah's operation. Margaret stood and walked to the Virgin Mary statue one final time. The empty compartment seemed to stare back at her like a blind eye, but she no longer needed the evidence that had once been hidden there. The truth was finally in the open, and she had found something more valuable than proof of her innocence. She had found the courage to stop running. "I'm ready," she told Agent Reese, holding out her hands, "for whatever comes next." The handcuffs felt lighter than she had expected, and as they led her from the chapel, Margaret Alpha Delacroix walked toward her reckoning with the steady gait of someone who had finally learned the difference between punishment and justice, between hiding from the truth and having the strength to help others find their way to it. The federal courthouse rose before Margaret like a cathedral of judgment, its limestone columns catching the morning light as Agent Reese guided her up the steps. 6 weeks had passed since that night in the chapel, 6 weeks of interrogations, legal conferences, and the slow, grinding machinery of justice attempting to process the scope of Sarah's network. Now came the moment Margaret had been both dreading and anticipating, Her formal hearing before federal judge Catherine Torres, who would determine not just her fate, but the future of the investigation into Sarah's victims. Margaret's hands, free of restraints for the first time since her arrest, trembled slightly as she adjusted the simple blue dress the court had provided. It felt foreign after 3 years in a nun's habit, but Agent Reese had assured her that appearances mattered. Today wasn't just about Margaret Alpha Delacroix, escaped fugitive. It was about Dr. Margaret Delacroix, the forensic psychiatrist whose expertise had become crucial to unraveling 15 years of orchestrated murder. "Remember," her court-appointed attorney whispered as they entered the marble-lined hallway. "Judge Torres has reviewed all the evidence. She understands the complexity of the situation. But she's also bound by federal law. There are no guarantees." Margaret nodded, but her attention was drawn to the familiar figure standing near the courtroom doors. Vincent Carrera, dressed in civilian clothes and flanked by federal marshals, looked smaller than he had on death row. Clean-shaven, with his hair trimmed short, he barely resembled the wild-eyed killer who had requested 5 minutes alone with the Virgin Mary. When their eyes met, he offered a tentative nod, not of friendship, but of mutual recognition between two people who had found their way back from the edge of an abyss. "Dr. Delacroix," he said as she approached. His voice was quiet, careful. "I wanted to thank you for believing me that night, for helping me remember who I was before she got inside my head." The words carried weight that only Margaret could fully appreciate. Vincent's testimony over the past weeks had led to the identification of 12 other men across 7 states, all manipulated by Sarah into committing murders they might never have contemplated alone. 3 had already been located alive, serving sentences for crimes they'd confessed to under Sarah's psychological influence. 2 more had died by suicide years earlier, unable to live with the guilt of actions they couldn't understand. The others remained missing, their fates unknown. "We're not finished yet," Margaret replied, feeling the truth of those words settle into her bones. "Whatever happens in there, this is bigger than both of us now." The courtroom itself was smaller than she'd expected, more like a conference room than the grand chambers of legal dramas. Judge Torres, a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and penetrating brown eyes, sat behind the bench reviewing a thick file. The prosecution table held 2 federal attorneys Margaret didn't recognize, while her own legal team consisted of a single overworked public defender and a victims' rights advocate who had volunteered to help navigate the unprecedented nature of her case. But it was the gallery that surprised her most. 23 people sat in the wooden pews, families of Sarah's victims, relatives of the manipulated killers, and 3 women Margaret recognized as surviving targets who had escaped Sarah's network before she could deploy her psychological weapons against them. They weren't here for vengeance or justice in any traditional sense. They were here because Margaret represented something none of them had dared hope for, the possibility of understanding. "Dr. Delacroix," Judge Torres began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades weighing impossible decisions. "You stand before this court having admitted to 3 years of federal fugitive status, identity fraud, and obstruction of justice. Under normal circumstances, these charges would result in significant prison time." Margaret felt her breath catch, but forced herself to remain standing straight. Everything she had learned in the chapel about facing truth without flinching came flooding back. "However," the judge continued, "this court has also reviewed extensive testimony about your cooperation in exposing a criminal network that spans multiple decades and jurisdictions. Your psychological expertise has proven invaluable in identifying victims who might never have found justice otherwise." Through the courtroom windows, Margaret could see the city stretching toward the horizon, millions of people going about their daily lives, unaware that they were witnessing a moment that would define not just her future, but the future of everyone Sarah had touched with her manipulations. Judge Torres set down her file and looked directly at Margaret, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "The question before this court is not whether you broke federal law. You did. The question is whether justice is best served by punishment or by allowing you to continue the work only you can complete. Margaret felt the weight of every choice she had made over the past 15 years pressing down on her shoulders. The moment of truth had arrived, and everything she had learned about courage, redemption, and the difference between hiding from consequences and facing them with purpose would determine not just her fate, but the fate of dozens of other lives hanging in the balance. The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Torres rose from the bench, her black robes rustling like wings in the profound silence. Margaret felt time stretch impossibly thin, each second containing the weight of 15 years of running, hiding, and finally choosing to stand still in the face of impossible truth. "Before I render my decision," the judge said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "I want to address the elephant in this room. Dr. Margaret Alpha Delacroix, you have spent 3 years living as a dead woman, hiding behind sacred vows while the real killer, your own twin sister, continued to orchestrate murders through psychological manipulation." Margaret's legs trembled, but she remained standing. In the gallery behind her, she could hear the soft breathing of families who had waited decades for answers, for someone to finally name the invisible hand that had guided their loved ones toward violence. "Some would call your actions cowardly," Judge Torres continued, and Margaret felt each word like a physical blow. "Some would say you abandoned your duty as a psychiatrist, as a citizen, as a human being with the knowledge and expertise to stop a killer." The judge moved closer to the bench's edge, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "But this court has reviewed something else, the testimony of 47 condemned prisoners who found peace in their final hours because of your ministry. Men who might have died filled with rage and denial instead faced their executions with clarity and acceptance, because you taught them the difference between guilt and shame, between punishment and redemption." Margaret's vision blurred as she felt tears she hadn't known were coming. Behind her, she heard Vincent's voice, barely a whisper. "She saved me when I thought I was already dead." "The question of justice," Judge Torres said, returning to her seat, "is rarely as simple as crime and punishment. Sometimes it requires us to weigh the value of retribution against the possibility of restoration, not just for the perpetrator, but for every life they might touch going forward." The judge lifted a thick folder, and Margaret recognized it as the case file Vincent had helped compile. Detailed records of Sarah's network, psychological profiles of her victims, and most importantly, the locations where 7 other manipulated killers might still be found alive. "Dr. Delacroix, your sister Sarah has been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, but her legacy, the men she broke and weaponized, the families destroyed by murders that might never have happened without her influence, that legacy remains unresolved." Margaret found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Your Honor, I understand the consequences of my actions, but I also understand that I may be the only person alive who can interpret my sister's psychological methodology well enough to identify her remaining victims, both the ones she manipulated into killing and the ones who died because of it." "Indeed," Judge Torres nodded slowly. "Which brings us to the unprecedented nature of your case. The federal prosecutors have recommended a suspended sentence contingent on your cooperation with an ongoing multi-state task force. You would serve as a consulting psychiatrist, helping to identify and rehabilitate the remaining members of your sister's network." The words hit Margaret like a physical shock. Not prison, work, not punishment, purpose. She gripped the defendant's table to keep herself upright. However, the judge continued, and Margaret's brief hope crystallized into fear. This arrangement would require you to confront every case personally, to interview each manipulated killer, to relive your sister's methodology over and over again, to face the full scope of the damage she caused using techniques you helped develop during your shared graduate studies. Margaret understood. This wasn't mercy. It was a different kind of sentence, one that would force her to carry the weight of Sarah's crimes in a way that simple imprisonment never could. She would have to look into the eyes of every broken man her sister had used as a weapon, help them find their way back to themselves and live with the knowledge that her own psychological research had provided the foundation for 15 years of orchestrated murder. "Your Honor," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I accept full responsibility for my choices, both the ones that led me to run and the ones that led me to finally stand still. If this court believes I can serve justice better by facing the truth than by hiding from it, then I'm ready to do that work." Judge Torres studied her for a long moment, then looked past Margaret to the gallery filled with families, survivors, and victims of her sister's network. "Dr. Margaret Alpha Delacroix," she said finally, "this court sentences you to 10 years supervised probation, contingent on your full cooperation with federal investigators and your service as consulting psychiatrist to the Sarah Delacroix Task Force. You will help us find them all, every last person your sister touched with her poison, and you will help them find their way home." The gavel fell like thunder, and Margaret finally understood that some kinds of justice could only be served by those brave enough to face the deepest darkness and guide others toward the light. The courthouse steps felt different beneath Margaret's feet as she emerged into the afternoon sunlight, not the triumphant walk of vindication she had sometimes imagined during her darkest nights in the chapel, but something harder and more honest. Freedom, but with chains, she had forged herself from years of running and the terrible mathematics of her sister's legacy. Agent Reese waited by a black sedan, holding a manila folder thick with case files. "Your first assignment," she said without preamble. "Thomas Henley, 41, currently serving life without parole in Arizona State Prison for the murder of 3 homeless veterans. His psychological profile matches your sister's methodology, and he's been asking to speak with someone about dreams he can't explain." Margaret took the folder with hands that no longer trembled. Inside was a photograph of a hollow-eyed man who looked like he had been carved from grief, and beneath it, handwritten notes in Sarah S. distinctive script, psychological evaluation techniques that Margaret recognized from their graduate work together 15 years ago. Her own research, weaponized. "How many more?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer would break something inside her. 43 confirmed cases across 12 states, maybe more. Agent Reese's voice carried the weight of months spent excavating the scope of Sarah's network. "Dr. Delacroix, I need you to understand what you're walking into. These men, some of them have been carrying guilt for murders they were psychologically coerced into committing. Others may be completely innocent, confessing to crimes they never committed because your sister convinced them it was the only way to find peace." Margaret closed the folder and looked back at the courthouse where Judge Torres had given her the chance to transform her expertise from a burden into a tool of restoration. Inside that building, Vincent was probably meeting with federal prosecutors, helping them understand the architecture of manipulation that had turned him into a killer. Soon, she would be doing the same work, not from the safety of a death row chapel where men came to her already facing their final hours, but in maximum security facilities across the country, confronting the living victims of her sister's psychological terrorism. "There's something else," Agent Reese continued, and Margaret heard the reluctance in her voice. "The families. They want to meet you." Margaret turned to see them emerging from the courthouse, mothers and fathers, siblings and children, all united by the common thread of loving someone who had been destroyed by Sarah's influence. They approached slowly, not with anger as Margaret had expected, but with something more complex, the desperate hope of people who had spent years trying to understand how their loved ones could have committed such violence. An elderly woman with silver hair and eyes like winter stepped forward. "Dr. Delacroix, my name is Elena Vasquez. My son Carlos killed 2 people in 1998, then took his own life. For 25 years, I've been trying to understand why." Her voice broke, but she continued. "The investigators tell me your sister got inside his head somehow, made him believe things that weren't true. I need to know. Was my boy still my boy when he died, or had she taken even that away from him?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow because it was the same question she had been asking about herself for 15 years. How much of who she had become was her own choice, and how much was the product of Sarah's lifelong manipulation? The distinction between victim and perpetrator, between responsibility and coercion, blurred like watercolors in the rain. "Mrs. Vasquez," Margaret said, finding strength in the honesty that had saved her life in the chapel. "I don't know yet, but I promise you this. I'm going to find out. Whatever it costs me, whatever I have to face, I'm going to learn how my sister broke these men, and I'm going to help you understand who your son really was beneath all that poison." One by one, the other families stepped forward. 17 people whose lives had been shattered by murders they couldn't comprehend, seeking not vengeance but understanding. Margaret realized that this was her real sentence, to carry not just the legal consequences of her choices, but the emotional weight of every life Sarah had destroyed, using tools Margaret had helped create. As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret found herself alone on the courthouse steps, with the weight of 43 case files and the knowledge that each one represented a human soul trapped in a maze of psychological manipulation only she could navigate. She thought of the chapel at San Quentin, of the simple wooden cross and the Virgin Mary statue that had hidden her secrets for 3 years. That sanctuary was lost to her now, but perhaps she could build something better. Not a place to hide from the truth, but a way to walk directly through the darkness and guide others toward whatever light could be found on the other side. The cost of her freedom was higher than prison could ever have been. She would spend the next decade confronting the true scope of her sister's evil, using her own expertise to heal wounds she had inadvertently helped create. But standing on those courthouse steps, Margaret Alford Delacroix finally understood the difference between punishment and penance and chose the harder path toward whatever redemption might still be possible. The courthouse steps stretched before Margaret like a pathway into an uncertain future, each stone worn smooth by the footsteps of countless people seeking justice in its various forms. She remained standing there long after the families had dispersed, clutching the manila folder that contained Thomas Henley's case file and feeling the weight of 42 more waiting in Agent Reese's sedan. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza, and Margaret found herself thinking of the chapel at San Quentin. How different this light felt from the filtered illumination that had fallen through those stained glass windows for 3 years. There, she administered to men who knew their fate, who came to her seeking peace in their final hours. Now she would be walking into maximum security facilities across the country to face men who might not even understand what had been done to them, whose guilt or innocence remained buried beneath layers of psychological manipulation she had helped her sister perfect. "Dr. Delacroix?" Agent Reese approached cautiously, as if sensing the magnitude of what Margaret was processing. "Are you ready for this? I mean, really ready. Because once you walk into that first prison and sit across from Thomas Henley, there's no going back to the sanctuary of not knowing." Margaret opened the folder again, studying the photograph of the hollow-eyed man who had spent years believing himself a monster. Beneath his image were pages of notes in Sarah's handwriting, clinical observations that Margaret recognized as variations on her own graduate research into trauma-induced dissociation, her life's work perverted into a tool of destruction. "I've been hiding from this truth for 15 years, Margaret said, closing the file with finality. "First by running, then by taking vows that let me serve God while avoiding the full scope of what Sarah had done with our shared knowledge. I thought the chapel was my redemption, but it was just another kind of prison." She looked back at the courthouse, where Judge Torres had offered her something more valuable than freedom, the chance to transform her expertise from a burden into an instrument of healing. Inside that building, Vincent was probably still meeting with prosecutors, helping them understand how Sarah had turned him into a weapon. The irony wasn't lost on her. The serial killer she administered to on death row was now her partner in exposing the true architect of his crimes. "There's something I need to tell you about the Henley case," Agent Reese said, her voice carrying a warning Margaret had learned to recognize. He's not just asking to talk about dreams he can't explain. He's been claiming for months that he remembers a woman who looked exactly like you visiting him in 1998, the week before he killed those veterans. A woman who convinced him they were enemy combatants who had betrayed their unit in Vietnam. The words hit Margaret like ice water. She had been in graduate school in 1998, working alongside Sarah on research into recovered memory therapy and psychological suggestion. They had presented joint papers on the malleability of traumatic memory, the ease with which false recollections could be implanted in vulnerable subjects. But she had never imagined Sarah was already field testing their theories. "She used my face," Margaret whispered, understanding flooding through her with horrible clarity. "She impersonated me. That's why he wants to talk. He's been carrying my image in his mind for 25 years, believing I was the one who destroyed his reality." Agent Reese nodded grimly. "And he's probably not the only one. Dr. Delacroix, you need to understand that some of these men aren't just going to see you as their potential salvation. They're going to see you as the face of their destruction. The question is, can you handle being hated for crimes you didn't commit while trying to heal damage you inadvertently made possible?" Margaret thought of Elena Vasquez's desperate question about whether her son had still been himself when he died. And she understood that this was the real test of everything she claimed to have learned about redemption. In the chapel, she had helped condemned men find peace with their guilt. Now she would have to help innocent men find peace with their false guilt, while carrying the weight of their hatred for a face they remembered but a crime she hadn't committed. The late afternoon light was fading, painting the courthouse steps in shades of amber and gold. Soon it would be evening, then night, then morning again, the beginning of a journey that would take her into the darkest corners of her sister's legacy and force her to confront every way their shared brilliance had been transformed into an instrument of psychological terrorism. Margaret Alpha Delacroix walked toward Agent Reese's sedan, carrying 43 case files and the knowledge that redemption wasn't a destination but a daily choice to face truth without flinching. She had learned to stop running, but now she would discover whether she had the strength to walk directly into the hatred, confusion, and broken trust her sister had left behind, and somehow find a way to guide 43 lost souls toward whatever healing remained possible. The return. 6 months after walking down those courthouse steps, Margaret stood in the visitors' parking lot of Arizona State Prison, watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of rose and gold. The manila folder containing Thomas Henley's updated case file sat on the passenger seat of her rental car, now thick with psychological evaluations, breakthrough sessions, and something she had never expected to find in her work with Sarah's victims: hope. Her hands no longer trembled when she entered maximum security facilities. The sound of electronic locks and the weight of correctional officers' scrutiny had become as familiar as the chapel bells that had once marked her days at San Quentin. But everything else about her had changed in ways both profound and subtle: the way she carried herself, the steadiness in her voice, the peace she had found not in sanctuary but in the hardest truths. Thomas Henley was waiting in the interview room, but the hollow-eyed man from the photograph had been replaced by someone Margaret barely recognized. His shoulders no longer curved inward with the weight of inexplicable guilt. When he looked at her now, she saw not hatred or confusion, but something approaching gratitude. "Dr. Delacroix," he said as she took her seat across from him, "I got your letter about the parole review. The Innocence Project attorney thinks we have a real chance." Margaret opened the folder, revealing months of documentation that proved what they had both suspected from their first conversation: Thomas Henley had never killed anyone. Sarah had implanted false memories so convincing that he had confessed to murders committed by an entirely different person, a serial killer who had remained free for 25 years while an innocent man rotted in prison. "The DNA evidence came back yesterday," Margaret said, unable to suppress the smile that had become more frequent as her work progressed. "Complete exclusion. You're going home, Thomas." She watched him process the words, saw the exact moment when 15 years of self-hatred finally crumbled. He wept without shame, and Margaret felt the familiar ache in her chest that came with witnessing a soul reclaim itself from the darkness. "I need you to know," he said when he could speak again, "that first day when you walked in here, I wanted to kill you. I saw your face, and I remembered her, the woman who convinced me I was a monster. I spent weeks planning how I would hurt you the way you hurt me. But you didn't," Margaret said gently. "No, because you kept coming back. You kept listening. And slowly I realized that the woman in my memories wasn't you at all. She was something wearing your face like a mask." He shook his head in wonder. "How do you live with that, knowing your sister used your identity to destroy people?" It was a question Margaret had learned to answer honestly, by choosing to use my real identity to help rebuild them, by understanding that I can't control what was done in my name, but I can control what I do with my name now. The drive from Arizona to Colorado took her through landscapes that had become as familiar as a rosary, desert giving way to mountains, highways that connected one maximum security facility to another, each stop marking another life reclaimed from Sarah's psychological terrorism. Her phone buzzed with updates from Agent Reese. Marcus Delano's conviction had been overturned in Texas. DNA evidence had exonerated David Park in Oregon. The network was crumbling, but each collapsed piece revealed another human being who could finally go home. As she pulled into the driveway of her small apartment in Denver, a modest place she had rented to be centrally located for her work across the western states, Margaret realized how different this homecoming felt from the desperate returns to hiding places that had marked her 15 years as a fugitive. This was not a sanctuary from truth, but a base camp for confronting it, not a refuge from responsibility, but a launching point for embracing it fully. Inside, her answering machine blinked with 17 messages. Elena Vasquez calling to thank her for the psychological profile that had finally explained her son's suicide. A prosecutor from Nevada requesting consultation on a cold case that matched Sarah's methodology. Vincent calling from a federal facility where he was serving a reduced sentence, asking if she had time to review his testimony for another trial. But the message that made her pause was from Judge Torres, Dr. Delacroix. "The parole board has asked me to review your case file in preparation for your first annual evaluation. I wanted you to know that in 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen someone transform their penance into such profound purpose. The court's faith in your rehabilitation has been more than vindicated." Margaret deleted the message and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there were 11 more men still trapped in Sarah's web of lies, still believing themselves guilty of crimes they had never committed. Tomorrow she would board another plane, walk into another prison, and sit across from another broken soul who needed to learn the difference between what was done to him and what he had actually done. She had returned to her world, but as someone fundamentally transformed, no longer the woman who ran from truth or the one who hid from it in a chapel, but someone who had learned to stand still in the face of the hardest revelations and guide others toward the same terrible, liberating honesty. This was her ministry now, not last rites for the condemned, but resurrection for the innocent, the new beginning. 3 years had passed since Margaret stood at her kitchen window, counting the 11 souls still trapped in Sarah's psychological web. Now, on a crisp October morning, she sat in the same spot with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands and an empty case file folder on the table. The last one. Jerome Washington had walked free yesterday, after serving 18 years for a murder he never committed. The network was finally completely dismantled. Her phone rang, breaking the profound silence that came with completed redemption. "Dr. Delacroix? This is Father Martinez from St. Catherine's. I know this is unusual, but we have a situation here that requires someone with your unique expertise." Margaret closed her eyes, recognizing the tone. Another soul in crisis, another mind shattered by psychological manipulation. The work would never truly end. There would always be people broken by forces they couldn't understand. always victims who needed someone who had walked through similar darkness and emerged whole. "What can I do for you, Father?" After hanging up, Margaret packed her familiar travel bag, the psychological evaluation forms, the patient interview protocols, the stack of business cards that now read simply Dr. Margaret Alpha Delacroix, consultant. The false papers and desperate disguises of her fugitive years had given way to this, her real name, her real purpose, her real peace. The drive to St. Catherine's took her past San Quentin. She hadn't seen the prison in 3 years, but she found herself pulling into the visitor parking lot, drawn by something she couldn't name. The chapel was visible from here, its stained glass windows catching the afternoon sun exactly as she remembered. Vincent's last letter, received 6 months ago, had included a photograph of him teaching a psychology class at the federal facility where he served his reduced sentence. His face had lost the hollow desperation she remembered from death row. In helping her expose Sarah's network, he had found his own form of redemption, using his intimate knowledge of manipulation to help other inmates recognize when they were being psychologically exploited. A correctional officer approached her car. "Ma'am, visiting hours are—" "I used to work here," Margaret said, rolling down her window. "Sister Margaret, from the chapel. I just wanted to see it again." Recognition dawned on the officer's face. "Sister Margaret, you're the one who—" He stopped, as if unsure how to finish. "We heard what happened. About your sister, about the men you helped prove innocent. That was something else." Margaret smiled, feeling none of the old shame that had once accompanied her exposure. "It was necessary work. Father Sullivan still talks about you, says you taught him the difference between offering comfort and offering truth. He's doing good work with the condemned men now, helping them face hard realities instead of just preparing them for death." As Margaret drove away from San Quentin, for what she knew would be the last time, she thought about the different woman who had walked into that chapel 5 years ago. Sister Margaret Alpha had been running toward God while fleeing from truth. Dr. Margaret Alpha Delacroix had learned to serve God by standing still in the center of the hardest truths imaginable. St. Catherine's turned out to be a halfway house for women leaving abusive relationships. The crisis Father Martinez had described was familiar, a resident who couldn't distinguish between real memories and false ones implanted by her manipulative ex-husband, a man who had used sophisticated psychological techniques to convince her she was losing her mind. "Dr. Delacroix," the young woman said when they met, "they tell me you understand what it's like when someone steals your own thoughts from you." Margaret sat across from her in the small counseling room, seeing herself at every age, the child manipulated by Sarah's early experiments, the graduate student unknowingly providing tools for psychological terrorism, the fugitive who had lost herself so completely she needed to become someone else entirely to survive. "I understand," Margaret said, "and more importantly, I understand that you can get them back. Your real thoughts, your real self, they're still there underneath everything that was forced into your mind. The work is hard and it takes time, but you can reclaim who you were always meant to be." That evening, Margaret returned to her apartment to find Elena Vasquez waiting on her doorstep. The elderly woman looked transformed, no longer broken by 25 years of inexplicable grief, but peaceful in the way that only complete understanding could provide. "I wanted to thank you one more time," Elena said, embracing Margaret like a daughter. "My Carlos is finally at rest. I know now that my boy died fighting against what your sister put in his head, not giving in to it. That makes all the difference." After Elena left, Margaret stood again at her kitchen window, but this time she wasn't counting the trapped or the lost. She was thinking about tomorrow's flight to Chicago, where a new case waited, not one of Sarah's victims, but someone whose mind had been shattered by different cruelties, requiring different healing. This was who she had become. Not Sister Margaret hiding from the world's pain in a chapel, not Dr. Delacroix running from her own guilt, but Margaret Alpha, a woman who had learned that true ministry meant walking directly into the darkness with others and teaching them how to find their own way toward light. The work would continue until her last breath, but it no longer felt like penance. It felt like coming home.